Hello, I am the Nihilist, as ever, and you are, as ever, listening to my Album of the Month Club podcast liner notes, June 2023. Every month in 2023, I, the Nihilist, am uploading via the lovely people at DistroKid a different album from my 20 plus year back catalogue of producing music. I'm uploading a different album from a back catalogue to all the major streaming platforms, including Apple Music, iTunes, Spotify, a bunch of other things that the names don't mean that much to me, like Deezer. I don't know that one. But hey, my music is available on Deezer if you are on Deezer and you want to check it out. I'm uploading a different album from my back catalogue, as I said, every month. And for June 2023, the album I'm uploading is called Metatron Meditations, or Meditations number 1, Metatron. As this project goes on, I've come to realize I'm pretty pretentious. Just going by the titles of the different albums that I've been uploading over the last few months, and I'm going to be continuing to upload between now and the end of this year, you might be wondering what Metatron Meditations or Meditations 1 Metatron actually means. The reason I've called it that is that this album was originally released under the artist title Metatron, with the album name Meditations, but I'm uploading it to Spotify under my own name, on my major production alias, which is The Nihilist, with the kind of subheading Metatron Meditations, as it's still music that me, The Nihilist, I have produced. Only when I released this stuff it was from around 2008 to 2011, I was using the artist title Metatron for this music, rather than my own name, The Nihilist. It was kind of a side project, but I've decided to comp all this music together into one album, which I've called Meditations, and the artist's name was Metatron. So uploading it to Spotify and all the other platforms, I'm still releasing it as The Nihilist, but I've decided to call it Meditations number 1 Metatron to make it a little bit clear that this wasn't released as Nihilist music, and putting it out under the name Metatron, or Meditations number 1 Metatron. It seems a little bit convoluted, but I wanted to explain why that is the name, and also to realize that yes, I can be quite pretentious when it comes down to it. So, like I mentioned, between the years of about 2008 and 2011, I released a series of 3 different EPs under the Metatron name. 2 of them were released on our own Glasgow-based net label at the time, which was called Little Rock. And the third, I think technically it was the second EP in chronological order, but I'm just going to say it was the third EP, was also released on the Edinburgh-based net label Black Lantern. Big shout out to Bram Gleben, aka Texture, and all the folk at the Black Lantern net label. I mentioned chronologically there, and at this point I do want to note that I've been doing this Album of the Month Club chronologically at this point. Each album that I've uploaded is kind of a snapshot of where I was at that particular point in time, the kind of music I was into, the music I was trying to create. I've been doing it chronologically up to this point, but last month I released the album And His Incredible Dancing Machines, which is a dubtronica album, kind of electronica dub, and I thought it made sense to follow up And His Incredible Dancing Machines dubtronica album with the Metatron Meditations album, as it's kind of chronologically works in terms of my exploration of dub influenced music. So last month's album, And His Incredible Dancing Machines, was recorded between 2006 and 2007. And now the Metatron Meditations material was recorded between about 2008 and 2011. And I wanted to put these two albums together in this release order just to display the kind of progress of my own personal music production style and the influence that dub-influenced music was having on my own particular sound and my own production techniques and stuff like that. So even though this album works chronologically in terms of the music genre, with this album, we're jumping forward a couple of years to put this stuff out. And next month, which is July, I'll be kind of going back towards around 2007 to 2008 to put out some of the other music that I was releasing at that time, which is a lot more straightforwardly electro, house, and Italo disco influenced based music. So this is a little bit of a detour to put this album in at June. I think if I was going to strictly stick to the chronological order of putting these albums out when they were released originally, this probably would be coming in around August or September time. It just felt more natural to put this album out in June as a follow-up to And His Incredible Dancing Machines. And so, to talk about the influences on the Metatron project and on the Meditations #1 Metatron album, probably the biggest influence on this album is a label that came out of, I think they were based in Bristol at the time, and I'm pretty sure that it doesn't exist anymore, but it was massively influential at the time that they started releasing their music, which is in around, as far as I'm aware, like 2007 up to about maybe 2012, that kind of 5-year period. It's a label called Skull Disco, which was run, as far as I'm aware, I could be getting this wrong. This is just pulling this stuff out of my memory. So apologies if this isn't technically correct, but I'm just going to go with this anyway. So it was run by two artists. One was called Shackleton and the other was called Apple Blim. And they put out a series of limited edition 12 inches and 10 inches, I believe. Kind of like 2 tracks per release kind of thing. But then they also compiled all these vinyl releases onto CD compilations. I think they were just called Skull Disco Volume 1 and Skull Disco Volume 2. And this was coming at a period when dubstep was really beginning to make big waves internationally. It was beginning to catch on in America. The style itself was beginning to become a bit more, how to say this, a bit more regular. Like when you said to somebody, I listen to dubstep, it meant I listen to music that sounds like this. But the music that was being released by Skull Disco and the artists like Shackleton and Apple Blim was, how to say this, like a kind of more progressive, deeper, moody, atmospheric, slightly minimalist take on what was being called dubstep at the time. And even though it was definitely very much dubstep music, because it had all the signifiers of what you would imagine dubstep to be, it was also kind of very much in its own little lane, and it was out there, and it was kind of pushing this aesthetic that was like a spooky look. I'm just gonna say it was goth. It was like gothic dubstep. And as somebody who's always been a low-key goth myself, it just really clicked with me, because the whole vibe of dubstep was so out there and so left field at the time that it made perfect sense to me to be drawn to the strains of dubstep that were more overtly gothic. From my point of view, there's always been a connection between the kind of more artistic fringe side of goth musical culture and the more kind of far out side of dub music in general, where they were really experimenting with stuff like delays and syncopated rhythms and weird recording techniques and stuff. I think I talked about this a bit more in last month's podcast when I was talking about the influence of dub music in general on my own production style. But with the Skull Disco, Appleblim, Shackleton stuff that was coming out at this point, it seemed much more overt. It was like, this is like spooky music. It was called Skull Disco, for God's sake. So it had a skull already attached to the aesthetic of it, and the design aesthetic that Skull Disco Records had was gorgeous. These amazing illustrations that were looked a bit kind of very gothic, had bones in them and smoke, and a kind of almost like a kind of voodoo aesthetic. It was really beautiful. So I think probably the first thing that attracted me to the Skull Disco vibe and the sound was seeing the covers of the CDs and going, this is cool. What's this? I love these graphics. And then being surrounded by lots of producers who themselves were dabbling in dub and dubstep and kind of like far out left field stuff, I started to hear the music, and it was very influential on me. I really loved it. I don't want to admit that I was trying to rip it off, because I feel like whenever I do try and do something that is very heavily influenced by a specific other producer or scene or sound or label or something like that, usually, look, I'm just going to come out and say it, usually I get it wrong, and I don't do stuff that necessarily matches up to the sound or aesthetic or even quality of the stuff that I'm personally trying to ape or personally taking influence from. But now, like 15 years later, looking back on all this stuff, at the time I felt that was a really negative thing, because I was really down on myself, thinking that like, oh, I'm never going to match up to those producers. I'm just a pale imitation of whatever it is that they're trying to do. But now, with the distance of that much time being put between where I am now and where I was then, I look back at it and I go, it's actually a good thing that this doesn't sound exactly like the stuff that was coming out on Skull Disco at that point. I think it's a good thing that it sounds a bit different. And, hopefully as listeners, you guys might be able to gauge that I can take influences of different genres, but I can hopefully make them my own and make something that still seems resolutely produced by the Nihilist, even if what I'm putting out there, like I said, heavily influenced by something quite specific, like the Skull Disco label. So I already mentioned Skull Disco and the influence that that particular label and those group of artists had on the sound of the Metatron Act and this Meditations 1 Metatron album. And then the other big influence on this Metatron, basically, like I mentioned earlier, was the Black Lantern label, which was coming out of Edinburgh at the pretty much the same time that in Glasgow we were running the Little Rock label and putting out the music that we were making, that we were trying to get people excited about. What I really liked about Black Lantern, the music was great. It was a bit more hip-hop orientated than what we were doing at Little Rock. At Little Rock, we were much more like based in like electro and also kind of like noise rock, whereas Black Lantern is very much hip-hop. Like those guys are like rappers and DJs and MCs, and the music that they were putting out was obviously influenced by hip-hop culture much more than our own take on the same thing, which was influenced a bit more by electro and noise rock, like I said. But the thing that really drew me to Black Lantern, beyond just the music and the fact that they were friends of ours and that we knew them and we would hang out with them and we would do gigs together and that kind of thing, was that they, as I could see it at the time, as somebody who was running a net label myself, Black Lantern was very instructive to us on how to do a net label and how to put these releases out. And it was great that in the last podcast, in the last Liner Notes podcast about And His Incredible Dancing Machines album, I mentioned the net label Jatari, which, like I said, massively influenced me and my friends to set up the Little Rock label in itself. So we took influence in the original setting up and deciding that net label, that's what we want to do. We want to download releases, not physical releases that are available for free for people who click on our website and click on the download and they download the music for free. That was influenced very much by Jatari. But then as we started to do Little Rock, in a landscape that seemed that there was very few other people around us doing this at the time, one of the only other groups that were out there doing the similar kind of thing was Black Lantern. And it was just great. It was just great that there was another label out there who were operating on a similar kind of like aesthetic principle that we were doing. And it helped us to feel not so alone. So I specifically wanted some of this music to be released on Black Lantern. I think it fitted in, as far as I could feel the music and hear and see, it fitted in more closely, I think, with the aesthetic of what they were doing rather than what we were doing. And it was just a kind of, I wanted to pay tribute to these guys who were putting out awesome music. And from a personal perspective, I'm not going to lie, I wanted to see if I could make something that was good enough for them to put out. And thankfully, they thought it was. And for that, I'll always be super grateful to those dudes for just bolstering my own confidence as a producer and as someone who was able to create music. And I go back and listen to this stuff now, and yeah, I think it sounds pretty decent. Like I mentioned, all of this Metatron music was produced between around 2008 and 2011. This was a funny period in my life, actually. I haven't gone into, on this podcast, great detail yet about what happened to me in 2007, although I think if you're a regular listener to this podcast, you might be sick of me trailing my 2007 life adventure and what happened to me then. I will do it in another podcast. I'll do it in greater depth because it's something I need to sit down and really think about formulating how I'm going to tell you what happened, because it was a very tumultuous year for me and I lost a lot of things in my life that year. It was the Saturn's return era for me. And yeah, so I was both achieving levels of success that I was both happy with in my own artistic life, but in my private life and shading into my artistic life, some big tumultuous things were happening that were not positive. They were very negative. And from around 2008 onwards, even though I was still living in Glasgow, I think I had a feeling in my heart that I needed to move away from that city. So between 2008 and 2010, I did a bunch of travelling around the UK. Some of it was to do gigs, some of it was to meet other people who were involved in the net label scene, and some of it was just to, go party in a different city and meet other people and, meet other queers, and my quest for, forming a decent romantic relationship and all that kind of stuff. I basically felt like I'd reached the end of the road in Glasgow, and I'd put so much effort into making music and doing things on that musical scene that I just needed a break from that particular time and place. So a lot of the music that was made in the Metatron mode was done on trains and on buses and not quite on planes. But while I was travelling in fairly long distance situations between Glasgow and Manchester and London, I was spending a fair amount of time going up and down between Glasgow and London, because obviously London is the centre of, the UK's music scene, even though Glasgow and Manchester have massively healthy music scenes of their own that don't really need the to qualify what they do by reference to London. They don't need that. They're of their own. They have their own things going on, and they don't need to be justified by London. But in my head, I was like, look, if I want to make a career for myself out of music, maybe I should be in London. So for a couple of years, I was up and down to London, doing gigs, meeting people, and actually looking for somewhere to live in London. So a lot of this meditation-based music that I made under the name Metatron has a vibe of travel. And there is one particular EP which I made, which had 3 tunes called Megabus, Transpennine, and I can't remember the last name, sorry, but I'll put the tune in after this and I'll tell you what the name of it is. These were musics that were made and songs that were made around traveling and going long distances. And obviously Megabus is a reference to the cheapest way to get from city to city in the UK, which is the Megabus service, where from memory I feel like you could get a bus from Glasgow to London, which is hundreds of miles, and took about I don't know how long that took. Was it like 7 hours to get from Glasgow to London in a bus? Whatever it was quite a long journey. And the cheapest way to do that was Megabus, which I think was about either £5 or £10 if you got the tickets early enough. Being able to get from Glasgow to London for a tenner was an amazing thing. And it was something I availed of a lot. And then I was also gigging in Manchester as well. And we had some residencies in Glasgow that continued even after I had moved out of Glasgow. I finally moved out of Glasgow, moved to Manchester in 2010, but I was still resident at a few clubs in Glasgow, so I would come up and down from Manchester to Glasgow on the train, which is called the Transpennine Express, hence one of the tunes being called Transpennine. And I think when you listen to this music, you can get that vibe. It's kind of rickety and clackety, but it's got a forward momentum, even though the aesthetic is still kind of like dubby and spaced out and stuff. But yeah, one of the EPs was all about travel. I think that kind of traveling and going on a long distance journey, I think you can very easily, you can very easily get that vibe from listening to the music. And there you have the track whose name I couldn't remember in the last section. And the track is called Monarch. And that was the third track off the Metatron EP that I released via Black Lantern. And the vibe of the entire EP, like I mentioned, was all about travelling. I think that there was probably some kind of travelling service that I used at the time, which was called Monarch, or something like that. There is also a bit of a reference there to the conspiracy culture that existed at the time and the obsession that a lot of people had with the monarch butterfly in the late noughties and early 2010s, and how this is around the period when Britney Spears had her very, very public and very actually quite disturbing and upsetting public meltdown. And she went into, I can't remember the word, but basically gave the entire power of her estate to her father. And that was obviously a very dark time for Britney Spears, but a lot of just commentators and people in the public said that she was being brainwashed. And I don't know about that. We don't have any facts about that stuff at the moment. I think hopefully at some point in the future the truth about this kind of thing will emerge. But at the time, a lot of people were saying that Britney Spears was basically being brainwashed by Satanists to try and usurp Christian morality in the mainstream. And one of the symbols that these brainwashing Satanists, who, let's be quite clear here, they were talking about queers as well. These religious conservatives, when they did this, conspiracy chat, it was low-key homophobic and coming for queer cultures and fan cultures that are a lot more based on kind of like liberal principles and leftism and, you know, very pro-queer and stuff like that. But at the time, the monarch butterfly was this very popular symbol amongst the far-right, uber-conservative conspiracy theorist people. So I think that there's probably a bit of a reference to that in there as well. I myself am very interested in conspiracy theories, a lot less so now because the culture around it has become very warped, especially within the last 3 or 4 years, and the appearance and the dominance of QAnon and all that BS, which, let's be absolutely clear here, QAnon and all that stuff is complete bullshit. Like, it's not real. But just to make clear, my interest in all this stuff comes from being a kid in the 90s and growing up watching the X-Files, which I was obsessed with, and it still remains to this day my favourite show. And conspiracy culture was quite often, I mean, if you've watched the X-Files, you know that that's a central part of what that show was about. But the show was also about things like UFOs and aliens and ghosts and monsters and telekinesis and psychic powers and all the stuff that I loved when I was a child. Like I said at the start of this podcast, I'm low-key a goth. Probably not so low-key to the people who meet me, or even many of you who've never met me can probably tell that I'm quite gothic when it comes down to it, yeah. But that's where my interest in that stuff came, and it's really funny looking back on that now and seeing that, like, how even further to the absolute totalitarian, conservative far right conspiracy chat and culture has been taken, because in kind of like the 90s and going into the noughties, a lot of that chat was coming from a very left-wing, kind of leftist, non-conservative, much more liberal point of view, because it was questioning powers that be. And at that time, those powers were conservative. So just to make that clear, that like we exist in a space now where a lot of these things are very, they're just like very right-wing and very totalitarian and used to prop up the existing power structures, which, I hate that stuff, because when I was growing up, an interesting conspiracy culture didn't necessarily mean that you had a low IQ. It meant that you had a very investigative kind of mind, and you could see that, there are holes appearing in the stories that the mainstream tells us about incidents that happened. And, I think a lot of that changed with September 11th, 2001, which is very understandable. It's not exactly a positive thing, but I think it is understandable. So I just wanted to take a little moment to talk about the word monarch and what that meant to me at that time, and why I might have called that tune that. The reason I'm talking about this kind of like left field, kind of woo-woo, spooky aspect of this project is because it's there quite plainly, actually. The name of the act, the artist name that I released this music under, is Metatron, which, if you're into Christian theology, you might recognize that name as being one of God's top angels that he used to, I think the story behind Metatron was that he would use Metatron to be his voice. So when God wanted to communicate something with man, the angel that would appear to talk to man was called Metatron. I could be wrong about that. I apologize to people who are much more involved in this culture and those belief systems than I am. But that's my very basic understanding of where the name Metatron comes from, which is also why I used an image of an angel on the sleeve of the compilation of these 3 EPs that I did under the name Metatron. Although at the time, my knowledge about Metatron and who Metatron is and what that means to certain people was very basic. I think I just saw it as a word that was like, that's cool. And like I said, it reminded me a little bit of Megatron, who was one of my favorite Transformers when I was a kid and was obsessed with Transformers and stuff. And I remember there was a point when I was talking to Bram Gleben, aka Texture, who ran the Black Lantern net label that was releasing some of this music, and he asked me, what, do you know what that means and are you into that? And I had to actually admit to his face that I don't, and it made me feel a bit silly, because it was like, am I appropriating something here that I should know more about? And possibly I should have known more about that. I mean, I don't think that I'm using it in an offensive way. It was just a cool artist name that to me fitted in with the general kind of gothic dubstep aesthetic of the skull disco scene and all those artists that I was basically trying to rip off with this music. So yeah, there's, that's something I wanted to say about the name Metatron. I hope that it's not something that anybody who listens to it will find offensive, because I don't think that I used it in an offensive way. I could be wrong, but I'm open to be criticised on that. Some of the other titles of the songs on this album are a bit more like this Archangelus, which obviously is a Latin version of the term archangel, which I believe Metatron was. And there is also This Is My Body, which if you're a Catholic, you will know what that means. It's a direct reference to Catholic Mass and one of the practices within Catholic Mass. Not that there really was anything beyond a surface level appreciation of these kind of spooky looking, coming at it from a kind of spiritualist angle, kind of like, oh yeah, this is kind of like spiritually and a bit spooky and a bit like a left field kind of thing out with mainstream religion, but it's still a religious belief that's practiced by a minority of people kind of thing. And like I explained, I've always been a spooky kid. I've always been a bit of a goth. Like I said, I grew up obsessed with the X-Files, and even before the X-Files, like when I was even smaller, like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 or whatever, there was a series of books that, I can't remember the name of the publisher, but I believe that they're being republished at the moment, actually. And it's called The Big Book of Monsters, The Big Book of UFOs, and The Big Book of Ghosts. And I had all of them. I was really into like spooky culture as a kid. So Metatron for me just chimed with spookiness and my interest in that kind of thing, and I just thought it was a cool name. So I just wanted to take a little moment there to explain why I used the name Metatron when it came to this act. And if there's anybody who would like to tell me more about who Metatron is and their importance to them, I'd like to hear it, actually, because like I said, I kind of felt put on the spot when Bram Gleben said to me, do you know what that means and who are you into that? And I was like, no, I just think it's a cool name, brah. So yeah, sorry about that. If it's anybody's like, why did you call it that? I hope my appropriation of somebody else's, even though it's a minority spiritual belief, isn't offensive. And if it is, I apologize for that. And speaking of kind of appropriations of different cultures as well, it's something that's been coming up for me in my reflection on making these musics. It's particularly the previous album I put out on Album of the Month Club, which is And His Incredible Dancing Machines, which is very much a straightforward dub record, really. It's dubtronica, so it's kind of electronica / electro dub, even kind of like it's kind of proto dubstep, because it's not really dubstep, but it's got elements of like techno and electro and stuff like that in it. And then also the progression of that kind of dub influenced aspect of my production style into this Metatron project. I've been thinking more and more about like my relationship to music of Black origins, and I always want to make it clear that I have the highest respect for this, and I know that as a white person that this is not necessarily my culture to be dabbling in, but I also don't think, I would like to think, at least I hope, that I'm not doing this in such an appropriative way to cause offense. And it's, that is a big deal for me, because I'm not doing any of this to cause offense to anyone. And if people would like to tell me how I'm doing it wrong, I'm very open to hearing that. So yeah, I just wanted to take this minute to say I'm sorry if this is not my lane and it appears like I shouldn't be doing this kind of stuff. As a music producer, especially at that point, a young music producer who was still like messing around with a lot of different styles and trying to find my own style, which I think I'm much better at it now. I think I have my nihilist style now, and the music that I'm currently creating with other producers helping me and stuff is a lot more refined, and I know what I'm about. At this point in my music production career, I was just trying different stuff because I wanted to try it. And that relationship to reggae-influenced musics, such as dub and dubstep, and even dubby house, or like there was an entire genre in the 90s, it's become a bit forgotten now, that was basically like dub house, dub techno, and like Underworld and Left Field and stuff that had really heavy dub influences in their sound. And there was like compilations come out that were specifically dub house and dub techno and stuff. I just want to, I hope that it's not me being a dickhead, basically, and it can be viewed as something that, it's a young artist should be allowed to, take inspirations from cultures and scenes that they're not a part of, while making it very clear that I didn't invent this. This is just me taking those influences and messing around with it. And I'm really sorry if, if I've fucked that up in any way. I really hope I haven't. I'd like to think I haven't, because I listen back to this music now and I don't think there's anything that offensive in it. I could be wrong though, because it's not my culture. So again, I'm just going to end this podcast by saying, it's been really interesting for me looking back at this music and thinking, should I have done this? I don't know. I mean, it's too late now. It's done. What's done is done. But also, if anyone has problems with me as a white person working within genres that, come specifically from a specific Afro-Caribbean cultural framework, then apologies for that. I do try and keep it very central to my work to acknowledge the influences of what I do. And I hold these cultures that have influenced me in the highest regard and the greatest esteem. And I would not actually want to put stuff out there into the world acknowledging references that I think are shit. You know what I mean? I'm not here to take the piss out of that stuff. It's fab and I love it. And anything that I do like this is coming from a place of absolute respect and love, and not anything hopefully detrimental to the original cultures that I'm taking influence from. Just wanted to make that point very clear at this point, as I put out these two very heavily dub influenced albums in a row as part of Album of the Month Club. The first one being and his Incredible Dancing Machines for May 2023, and then for June 2023 this Meditations Metatron album compilation of dubstep stuff. I'm still keeping, as in terms of my own music, I'm still keeping very dub influenced things going on in there. But I would not say that the music that I make now is dub. Definitely got elements of that, but I wouldn't want to say now that the music I make is dub, because that might be a disrespect to actual dub producers who are out there doing that and making great music and stuff. It's just to acknowledge, looking back now from about 2024, well, in the past, you'll know this from the last podcast that I did as well, but roughly from about 2002, maybe up till about 2012 even, or something like that, the influence that Jamaican-based music was having on my production styles was massive. So I just want to make clear that I still love Jamaican music. Absolute respect to anybody who's working within that milieu, especially the people who are of Afro-Caribbean heritage. It's amazing. It's so good. And apologies to anyone who thinks that, I might be taking the piss or anything like that. I'm absolutely not. My love for that music is absolutely genuine and pure. I just wanted to make that point of view very clear at the end of this podcast. So anyway, that brings us to the end of this month's Liner Notes podcast. I will be back next month with, I think I'm going to be putting out next month, not just an album, but a whole raft of singles that I had produced around the kind of 2007 to 2010 period, including releases that were put out on a few different labels that I was working with at the time, which was the start of my, I'm putting music out with other labels rather than just putting it out myself kind of era. So I'll be back next month with an album and probably a whole bunch of singles that I'm going to be putting out, which I might do as a side project called Singles of the Month. But until then, I'm leaving you with some more music from the Metatron Meditations album via the Nihilist, which you can currently hear on Spotify, iTunes, Apple Music, Deezer, whatever that is, and all the major streaming platforms. And until next month, goodbye.